Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes before we go ahead and get started tonight. Give everybody a chance to sign on. All righty. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so happy to have you all here this evening to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's virtual author series. Tonight, we are so pleased to welcome award-winning author Sarah Owens to discuss her 10th anniversary edition of her James Beard Award-winning cookbook, Sourdough. Recipes for rustic fermented breads, sweets, and savories, and more. At any time during this program, you can ask questions, so make sure to leave them in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to as many as possible tonight. You can also purchase copies of Sourdough from our local independent bookstore, The Learned Owl, and I'll provide the link below in the chat. And make sure to check out our website, hudsonlibrary.org. We have a ton of exciting upcoming programs, both virtually and in person, and we'd love to have you all come join us. Now, let me introduce tonight's speaker. Sarah Owens is a horticulturalist and a celebrated James Beard Award-winning cookbook author who specializes in fermentation and sourdough baking. Her work seeks to intersect between the natural world and the most celebrated aspects of living. Owens is the former curator of roses at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden and is the author of additional cookbooks, including Heirloom, Toast and Jam, and the Apricot Lane Farms Cookbook. And I know these are quite popular because they're always checked out at our library. Tonight, we're so excited to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Sarah's James Beard Award-winning for baking and desserts cookbook, Sourdough. It offers 101 recipes using natural, made-from-scratch sourdough starter for more nutritious, tastier results, and it goes well beyond bread into a wide world of other baked goods. Welcome, Sarah, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me, Alexandra.
All right, and you have a demo for us tonight to talk about your cookbook
I
and to
do.
introduce everything to everyone.
Yeah, so I thought that I would demo a few of the steps of the honeyed spelt and oat. So this is a recipe that's on page 123 of the anniversary edition. And I thought I would do a bread tonight because sourdough breads are probably what I get the most questions about. So I have a few different steps of that recipe prepared. So we are going to mix, we're going to shape, and then if we have time, I will show how to score a loaf of bread to bake as well. So lots to talk about. I am very open to receiving questions. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I have prepared, I'm going to adjust my camera to the bowl. I have prepared in the bowl the water, and I also have the honey in the bowl. And I'm going to go ahead and add the leaven. So the leaven is the step between your starter and the dough. So I used a little bit of my very well-fed active starter and fed it some spelt flour and some water. And I let that mature. This has been going for about 6 hours now, and it has doubled in size, so it's very ready. And you can see when I put a spoon in it, it's very active. There's bubbles that are breaking the surface. So that tells me it's ready to go into the bowl. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer that into the bowl. Normally, I would just prepare it inside the bowl, but my bowl was busy earlier today. This is my favorite bread mixing dough, bowl. So I'm going to put that in the bowl, and then this is my oat soaker. So these are rolled oats that have been scalded with hot boiling water and then left to cool. And you can see that they've kind of gelatinized as they've cooled, and that helps unlock some of the sweetness that's naturally present in the oats, and it also contributes moisture to the baked bread. So this is a very tasty loaf. It's a very pleasing loaf. It's also for a sourdough bread. It is one of the breads in the book that has a lower hydration. And so it's a lot easier for a lot of people to learn how to bake it because it's just easier to handle in terms of mixing and also baking. Now, that said, I am using some regional flours today. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about adjusting a recipe to use regional flours. And this is something that when I wrote the first book, the first version of the book, uh, we were mostly using store-bought flours and some regional stone ground, more specialty flours were coming onto the market, but now we have a lot more choice, and so people are interested in using more locally grown and milled, stone milled specifically flours. So I'm using some that are local to me here in California. And on the West Coast, we have very thirsty flowers, especially compared to New York, where I wrote and developed a lot of these recipes. So I'm going to be using some flowers that are going to need a little bit more water. And I'm just going to demonstrate that as I do the mixing. So it's going to angle the camera back to the bowl. I'm going to actually adjust the camera so that you can see into the bowl a little bit easier. Have a little bit of a shadow. It's starting to get dark earlier here. So in this bowl, I have measured my spelt flour and also some bread flour. And to mix, I'm just gonna put my hand right into the bowl. And I like to use one hand clean and one hand to mix, and use my clean hand to rotate the bowl. And as I'm mixing, to sort of grab and squeeze, grab from the sides and squeeze in the middle. Now, I already know that I'm going to need to add a little bit more water, but at this point, if I didn't know that, the dough would tell me because it's a little bit hard for my hand to get the flours completely hydrated without really straining my wrist or my hand or my arm. So that tells me I need to use a little bit more water. And so I have that measured in my little jar, and I'm going to add a little bit at a time until that dough comes together. And this also helps me really get to know the flours that I'm working with. Over time, if you do decide that you want to work with more local or regionally grown flours, especially those that are stone milled, they almost always are more thirsty than conventional store-bought flours. And so over time, as you get to know their performance, you'll be able to guess how much you need to adjust any recipe to accommodate those flours. Also, something to look out for when you are using rolled oats, depending upon whether they were soaked or steamed before they were flaked. If you bought them and didn't flake them yourself, they will have different ways of absorbing water. And sometimes when I'm traveling to teach, as I was doing last week in Michigan, I used some oats that even after they were scalded, they weren't thick like they were when I showed you before. They actually didn't absorb a whole lot of water. And so the dough actually was a lot looser because of that. So with a recipe, I often say we're sort of, suggesting to you what will work, and most likely it will work. But if you are using ingredients that have not been standardized to perform exactly the same way every single time, sometimes you have to pay more attention to the sort of sensual cues of baking, especially when you're working with a variable leavening agent such as sourdough. But this is a very forgiving recipe. It's also very delicious. It's an excellent sort of everyday bread. It's very high in whole grains, but it doesn't feel heavy or like it's a whole grain bread. So a lot of people really appreciate this loaf. Even people tell me that their kids really love this loaf too. And there's just that natural sweetness from the oats, and then the digestibility and the natural nuttiness and somewhat sweetness of the spelt flour as well. Okay, so now that I have it mixed, I cleaned down the sides of the bowl with my bowl scraper. And I just sort of gathered the dough to the middle of the bowl. I haven't added my salt yet, but I'm going to let this rest and relax before I add the salt, and then feel it to see if I think I might need to add a little bit more water. But I think this is feeling pretty good right now. Again, this is a stiffer dough than a lot of sourdoughs tend to be. So it's just something to take note of if you are used to making sourdough breads that are high in hydration. This one might feel a little bit different to you. Okay, so while that's resting, I'm just going to quickly rinse my hands, and then I'm going to do a very short demo on how to shape a loaf. Okay, so when the dough is sitting in the bowl for the next 3.5 to 4 hours, I will add the salt. I'll mix that in, get it nice and dissolved into the dough. And then for the next 3.5 to 4 hours, I do what's called a stretch and fold. I'll show you what that looks like in just a few minutes. And then at the end of that 3.5 to 4 hours, which is often what we call bulk fermentation, it's time to shape. And so I have some dough set aside here that is ready to shape. So one of the ways that I know that is because it is almost doubled in size, not completely, but almost. And then it's feeling very puffy. It feels what I like to call very marshmallowy. It's a very technical term. And so it's feeling very different than this kind of shaggy, sticky mass that it felt like in the beginning of the mixing period. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that. I'm going to be shaping it into an oblong. This is called a proofing basket. I prefer to use proofing baskets with a linen liner. So keeping in mind what shape I need to shape into is how I'm going to shape my loaves. And when we do shaping, we do it in 2 stages. The first stage is the pre-shape. So that's just sort of the suggestion to the dough of what you want it to become. And then the final shaping, sometimes that's a repeat depending upon what the dough is telling you. Sometimes it's a simpler method. I'll show you that. But on the final shaping, you're trying to roll and tuck and get more tension across the surface of the loaf, so that as it expands in its final proofing, the dough can capture and trap the gases that leaven our loaf. So I'm going to show you that pre-shape, and then I'm going to show you the final shape as well. Okay, bear with me, trying not to make you too dizzy. Okay, so I'm going to put my loaf here. First, I'm going to put a little bit of flour down on the work surface. And then I'm going to use my bowl scraper to transfer the dough onto my floured work surface. Okay, so this is 1 loaf. The recipe is actually for 2 loaves, but thought I'd just do 1 loaf tonight. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to fold. So I'm going to do that with lightly floured hands. I'm going to fold this dough to the middle. I'm going to fold the bottom to the middle. I'm going to rotate the loaf, and then I'm going to roll from the top to the bottom. Okay. So at this point, what I'm going to do is let this loaf relax. And when I say relax, it's going to kick its feet up, and no, it's going to kind of, the dough is going to spread out a little bit. This is, again, a low hydration dough, so it's not going to spread like a lot of sourdoughs do. But I want to see it's kind of visibly relax before I move into that final shaping. If I move into the final shaping before it relaxes, then I risk sort of ripping or tearing the dough, and that's something that I don't want to do. A lot of folks who come to sourdough baking from baking only with yeast or instant yeast, one of the big differences is that with sourdough, we are trying to constantly build up the dough. Rather than with yeasted doughs, where we're often doing something we call punching down or deflating the dough when we are proofing it and shaping it. So that's something that's very different. We're often being very mindful of how we handle the dough with sourdoughs. So I'm going to set that aside with my bench knife. And then I'm going to go back to the dough that I just mixed, and I'm going to add the salt, and I'm also going to feel if it needs any more water. Okay, and the way that I do that is often I'll just kind of pick up the dough and I'll feel, and this feels actually quite sticky. So I'm just going to say that that's good. But what I do need to do is mix in the salt. So I'm going to go ahead and use my hand to mix that in. Some people like to do a folding motion. I like to do kind of a similar motion to what I was doing earlier when I was mixing. And I just need to make sure and work that salt in completely so that it dissolves into the dough. And if I feel like I need a little bit more water just to help with the dissolving, I can just sprinkle a little bit of water in if I need to. Okay. All right, so sometimes it takes a little bit of diligence, especially with a dough that is not very highly hydrated. Okay, so I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my oven is preheated. I'm going to go ahead and preheat my Dutch oven. And I'm going to take a peek and show you the loaf that I have proofing. And we're going to talk about whether it is ready to bake or not. And if it is, we will bake it. If it's not, we might not bake it. And you also might have some questions. So I'm going to go ahead and preheat my Dutch oven to, my oven's quite cold. So I'm going to preheat that to 500. And I just want to show you what my Dutch oven looks like. In case you've never baked with a Dutch oven before. I think most people at this point have. But I'm baking with This is a ceramic Dutch oven. I really like this Dutch oven because it is lighter weight. So lighter weight than a cast iron Dutch oven, which is also a great option. Cast iron, unlike a ceramic Dutch oven, will not break. So with a ceramic Dutch oven, you just have to be mindful of not bumping it or cracking it. So I'm going to preheat the Dutch oven with its lid, and then we're going to take a look at the loaf. So the loaf that I'm going to show you, I shaped it actually this morning. So I got up quite early to mix the dough and shape it. Okay, so it's feeling pretty good. It feels like I could bake it. It would probably benefit from another half an hour or so of proofing. But one of the things that I like to really drive home is that you kind of sometimes with baking bread, especially because there are so many steps, you have to figure out how to make the bread work for you rather than you rearranging your life to work for the bread. So one thing that I can do, knowing that this needs a little bit longer to proof, is finish up my demo of the shaping. And then when I do the scoring, because I know that it's underproofed, it's going to have a much more explosive oven spring. And so knowing that, I will want to score a little bit deeper than I typically would, because I know that the loaf is going to open up with much more force in the oven. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm going to put this back. I have a little proofing box off camera, so I'm going to put it back in the box while I finish out showing you how to do the final shaping on our loaf. Okay, and if you live in a cold climate, which I think a lot of you do in the winter, a proofing box, if you do a lot of baking at home, bread baking at home, especially with sourdough, sourdough loves to be comfortable. And if it's too cold in the winter, it will move very, very slowly. So a proofing box or something to keep your starter and your dough in that 75 to 78 degree range is really, really helpful. Okay, so I'm going to just do that final shaping, and then we will move on. I'll see if we have any questions. And then we'll see what we can talk about. Okay, so I'm going to adjust the camera once more. I have my loaf here. Okay, so when I'm doing my shaping, what I'm going to do is again put down a little bit of flour, and then I'm going to pick up the loaf with my bench knife, and I'm going to turn it over so that the seam side is facing up. Okay. And with my floured hands, at this point, I could repeat that same process, or because this hasn't sort of relaxed a whole lot, it's not very loose, what I'm going to do is just roll from the top down. And using my thumbs, I'm tucking and I'm sort of pushing into the dough on the surface, the work surface. And then I'm rolling and tucking until I get all the way over. Some people like to pinch the ends closed. Other people like to leave it open. It's really up to you. I like to pinch to keep that tension. So right now the seam is running lengthwise down the loaf. And so I'm going to seal that seam by tucking into it with my bench knife. I'm going to give it support with one hand and tucking with the other. I'm going to turn it over into my hands and cradle it into the basket. And you may have noticed that I floured the top of the loaf before I put it in the basket. I find, especially in humid climates, that sometimes flouring the loaf rather than the basket means that you have to clean the basket less. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you are using an unlined basket, then you will want to flour both the basket and the top of the loaf. Okay, so at this point, it is ready to go into the refrigerator overnight. And I like to use, these are reusable. You can use these for bowls or for your proofing baskets, and they come in lots of different sizes. They're reusable, they're washable, they're really great. So I like to cover it and then put it into the refrigerator overnight, and then the next day do my final proofing. And that refrigeration overnight helps with improving the flavor of the loaf. It also helps with improving the digestibility. So one of the things about sourdough that's very different from yeasted breads is we have this bacterial fermentation in addition to the wild yeast fermentation. And that bacterial fermentation, especially when you give the bread a long, slow rest in the fridge, it works to help break down both the gluten and also some other aspects of different types of flour, not just wheat, that can present digestibility difficulties for some individuals. So that long, slow rest contributes to a lot of different things. However, if you are, let's say, doing a demo in the afternoon and you want to mix up your dough in the morning, you can also adjust the schedule and simply refrigerate your loaves for a couple hours or not at all after shaping, and then go straight into your final proofing, which usually takes about, with this loaf, about 3 to 4 hours at a warm room temperature before it's ready to bake. Okay, so I think that while the Dutch oven is warming up, what we could do is, if there are questions, we could take some questions. And then if we have time toward the end of the hour, I can do the scoring, which takes about 3 or 4 minutes.
Sounds good. All right.
Okay.
I have a lot of questions going on as it goes.
Okay.
We have someone would like to know, could you please explain what you mean by leavening?
Sure. Okay, so the leaven is the step in between your starter and your dough. So in the book, maybe I'll just show you, there's instructions on how to create that. And basically your starter, you're keeping your starter going in perpetuity. So you're never using all of your starter. You always want to have some waiting in the wings for you. Most people keep that in the refrigerator when they're not baking. But when you are ready to bake, you often need to wake up your starter. So you need to give it a feeding. And there are instructions in the book on how to do the feeding. And then you use a little bit of your active starter to create what I call the leaven, or some people call the levain. And so in the book, you have here, it says for the leaven. So it uses 30 grams of your starter with 40 grams of water and 40 grams of whole spelt flour. And the leaven step is really, it offers you an opportunity to use a different type of flour than what you use to feed your starter. Sometimes it gives you the opportunity to use a different amount of water than what you would typically use to maintain your starter. And both of those things, a different amount of water or a different flour, affects the flavor, and it sometimes affects the texture of your baked bread. So while you can also just simply feed your starter and use an active starter to make bread. Nothing wrong with that. The leaven for this bread uses spelt flour. I maintain my starter now with whole wheat flour. So using the spelt flour, it adds a little bit of sweetness to the final loaf. It also sort of prepares the dough for receiving more spelt flour. So it just basically gives you some options.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Mhm.
I have Betsy would like to know, how do you know how much water to add initially, and what are you looking for?
Sure. So I suggest just following the recipe initially, which may work for you. One of the things that I'm looking for, as I was describing in the demo, is how difficult is it for me to actually get the flour fully hydrated. If it feels really hard on my wrist or my arm or my hand, and I'm a pretty strong person, to get that flour hydrated, then I know I need to add a little bit more water. With a lot of sourdough breads, you're looking for a really kind of almost a wet dough. That's not necessarily the case with this particular recipe. So I do suggest starting with just the recipe itself. If it feels like it's resisting being mixed by hand, then add 20 to 30 grams more water, and that usually is plenty, which is not a lot more water, but 20 to 30 grams usually for most stone ground flours, different regional flours. That's usually the sweet spot, is 20 to 30 grams more water.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, trying to group these together in a way that makes the most sense logically. So if you have any questions, please make sure to put them in the Q&A because we're going to try to get through them all. Dot would like to know, do you always add salt after mixing in all the flour? If so, why?
Okay, this is one of those questions I get asked a lot, and I'll very simply say no, I don't always add it after mixing. I actually, when I was doing, I don't do production baking anymore, but when I was living in New York, I had a small scale production bakery and was doing a lot of mixing by hand. And I got into the habit of adding salt in the beginning of the mix, especially recipes that I was very familiar with. The thing about salt is salt does so many more things for us besides making things taste salty. So salt with dough is a fermentation regulator, and a lot of dough recipes are actually just formulas. And most dough formulas add 2% salt, and that is a great amount for regulating the fermentation. So, not allowing the fermentation to go too fast before we actually get development on the dough, before we get gluten development on the dough. So, salt, it pulls water away from the flour sometimes. And so it makes the dough a lot slower to do the gluten development that we're looking for. And that gluten development is actually important because it's the network that actually captures and holds the fermentation gases. And that capture and holding is what leavens our bread. So these are important things, but when I do add salt at the beginning, whether it's in a production bake or sometimes when I'm teaching and it's a day full of like 6 or 7 different recipes and I'm just trying to get through all the recipes, I'll add the salt in the beginning. But I know what I need to do is, rather than doing my stretches and folds to develop the dough every 30 to 45 minutes, in that first hour, if I add the salt in the beginning, I'll do stretches and folds, let's say every 20 minutes. And then after the first hour, when I start to see that the dough is coming together as it should, then I go to every 30 to 45 minutes.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was so informative.
Yeah, I could go on and on.
No,
There's more like information about specific flowers, but That's maybe for another time.
No, people wrote in that answered everything for me. So that
Okay,
was incredibly helpful. Thank you.
great.
I
Mm.
have another person in here. Carlene would like to know, she says, I struggle to make the bread follow my schedule. What hints do you have to help do that?
Yeah, I think you're not alone. So, I think one of the things to remember is that often when we are first starting out baking, we're trying to just follow instructions and we don't know exactly why we're doing what we're doing. But as we, I think, go along in our bread making practice, we kind of learn the why behind the how. And then we can make some adjustments. For example, with this recipe, the schedule is that you refresh your starter, you use your refreshed starter to build your leaven, and then you mix your dough. 3.5, 4 hours later, you shape, you put it in the fridge, you bake it the next day. But there's so much flexibility within that schedule. And what a lot of cookbooks authors often try to keep it as simple as possible so people don't get confused. But one of the things, for example, that I did with this recipe today was rather than making the dough, late last night so I could bake it off this afternoon, early evening, I made it early this morning, only refrigerated it for a couple of hours, didn't even need to do that. And then I final proofed it and I'm baking it now. So there's a lot of different things that you can do along the way. If you don't have a lot of time, um, to adjust. I think it's a little bit easier for me to answer if people are like, oh, I only have Friday and Saturday, or I only have Sunday night and Monday morning. Um, but basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is you can mix and bake in the same day as long as you've prepared your leaven the night before. Is maybe an easier way to answer that.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm trying, like I said, to group them all because I think logically it would make the most sense. We have a
Sure.
lot of questions coming in about tools, but before I get to that,
Mm,
we have someone in the chat would like to know, where do you get your local flour? Because you promote or want to
yeah.
encourage using it. Where would you recommend people looking if they're new to this whole process?
Sure. So, one of the biggest differences in the anniversary edition of Sourdough is in the back of the book, we have a greatly expanded resource section where you can buy flour by state. So, it's on page 261. And this used to be a one-page situation, and now it's like multiple pages. So there's also tips on, where to get tools and that sort of thing as well. I'll also say that I have a resources section on my website. This is something that's expanding. Like every week, I'm hearing about a new mill somewhere in the US or Canada. So my website is ritualfinefoods.com. There's a resources section. There's also an events section if you ever want to take a full-on class with me. But that resources section, I'm constantly updating. It's also listed by state. And so what a lot of people do is if there's not someone local to them, like if you can't go to a farmer's market and find someone there, they'll do mail order within their region. There are more and more small mills popping up all over, but the one of the biggest setbacks for small farmers and small millers is equipment. So often it makes more sense to support your regional grain network. And depending on where you are located in the country, different places have different capabilities of growing different types of grains depending on the climate, depending on the size of farms, the tracts of land, and then growing grains that are appropriate to all of that. But here in California, we're spoiled for choice on the West Coast in general, I would say, but there are more and more mills popping up all over.
Thank you so much. And I put a link in the chat to your website for more information and the link directly if you'd like to purchase a copy of the anniversary edition of Sourdough at and support our local independent bookstore, the Learned Owl. We have a lot of questions coming in about tools. And
Okay.
um, I will say, because I was briefly able to get my hands on a copy of your book, because it has been
Mhm.
checked out or on hold for everyone. So like as it was coming back, I was able to like sneak a peek because I'm still on hold for it. It's very
Oh.
popular at the library right now. And it just came out in October, just
Mhm.
a little bit ago. So
Yeah.
it has not been able to sit on the shelf since it came in. But one of the nice things about the book, and I encourage you all, she does, in addition to all the resources for local flour, it breaks it through each of the steps and the demos, the
Mm.
photos, but you have a whole section on like your artisan toolbox on different
Mhm.
tools. And we have people who would like to know, um, when it comes to like, is there a size, all different tool questions. So is there a size Dutch oven that you prefer to work with? Or maybe a best one if it's a beginner?
Yeah, if you don't have a Dutch oven and you are looking to purchase one, um, there are so many options now. There used to only be like a couple of options. Now there are many options. I am a believer that if I'm going to have a tool in my kitchen, it needs to provide more than one service. So I like Dutch ovens that I can use for other things besides just baking bread. So while a cast iron Dutch oven works really well and it's often at a really great entry point, price wise, I often go for a 5 to 7 quart. I like a 7 quart because it just gives me a little bit more wiggle room in terms of, actually loading the loaf into the pot. You can bake small loaves, you can bake bigger loaves if you want to. However, there are now these specialty cast iron sort of specific to baking bread. I'll call them like a cloche, that are very heavy and of heirloom quality. There's one called the Challenger breadware pan. It's a lot more expensive than a typical cast iron Dutch oven, but it's even bigger and more oblong shaped, and you can bake pan loaves, you can bake hearth loaves, you can bake all kinds of things. If that's outside of your budget, or you're not interested in having a really heavy Dutch oven, there are also now Broad and Taylor makes. Um, I would show you, but I would have to dig in my cabinet. They make these, they call them a steel shell. So it's a very lightweight shell, and you preheat steel. Um, uh, oh gosh, the word just left my brain. Stone. It's not a baking stone. It's a steel, basically a piece of steel. Uh, on your rack, you preheat the steel, and then you preheat the shell, and then you simply load your loaf onto the preheated steel. Put the shell on top, and then that functions as like a two-piece, like a Dutch oven. The thing about the shell is it's very lightweight. It does not take nearly as long to preheat as a Dutch oven. So there's so many options now. It really just depends on what your personal priorities are. All of them work very, very well. Um, I like the ceramic because I feel like it transfers heat very evenly. I never get burnt bottoms. It's lightweight. The only drawback is that you can crack it, and I have cracked them before, and they're not cheap. So that's the only drawback. And then there's, of course, just the option to use a baking stone, and then a pan with water underneath. I will say that a lot of people get mixed results with that, but it is a fairly easy way to go, especially if you plan on using your baking stone for more than just baking bread, such as pizza or other things. flatbreads, pita, that type of thing. So I don't really have like, this is the one. I think it's all sort of contextual to your priorities.
Hey, sorry about that.
It's okay.
The library announcement's going. We do have another couple just quick questions, and one was, do you recommend if someone doesn't have a proofing box, would that be a tool that you'd recommend them looking into? And could you just briefly explain what that is? And the second
Sure.
tool-based question was, they had a question if you needed to use like a stainless steel bowl when you're doing, if there was a
Mm,
that was a if that was a brand or something that you recommended, like if that was a good tool.
yeah, I'll start with a bowl. So the material of the bowl that you mix in will affect how it proofs in your kitchen. So, for example, the bowl that I like to mix in at this time of the year is a thin metal bowl. And I like it because it transfers the warmth of the room to the dough better. But in the summer when it's hot, or if we're in a in a heat wave here in Northern California, we don't have air conditioning, but we're experiencing more and more of these really extreme heat waves. So if for some reason I need to make dough in the middle of a heat wave, I would rather actually use a heavy ceramic bowl because that is more insulating. For the same reason, glass also more insulating. I would say ceramic is more than glass, but for me, it depends on the time of the year. It depends on how cold or warm my kitchen is. So that there's no real, wrong or right type of bowl. Other than I would, never mix in a reactive bowl. So I would never mix in like a copper bowl because the acidity of the dough would react with that. Or most most places now don't sell raw aluminum bowls, but I have, made bread in different countries where there's like raw aluminum is used a lot. And that can also react with the acidity of the dough. So those things I would not use, but otherwise, most stainless steel bowls, most ceramic or glass bowls, they're all very appropriate. Again, I'm not a fan of really heavy things. I've spent so much time on my feet, been over a counter in the kitchen that I prefer when I can to use a lightweight bowl. But if it's hot, ceramic or glass is my way to go. With the proofing box, so again, I'm not a fan of having like equipment in my kitchen just for the sake of having like a toy or something cool. I, have limited space. And so I resisted for a long time getting a proofing box. But I'm so glad that I have one. I also have a proofing setting on my oven, and many people do have that option for a lot of modern ovens. There's a proofing option, and depending upon your oven, you'll want to, if you have a proofing option, you'll want to check the temperature because some ovens, they will proof at like 110 degrees, which is a little bit too hot for sourdough. So it's just something to keep in mind. But there are lots of different proofing options now also. And I would say, with more time, we will have even more options. But I really like, and I'm not sponsored by Broad and Taylor, but I really like the Broad and Taylor folding proofing box. So when I'm not using it, it collapses and folds, and I can store it on a shelf without taking up too much space. And I find that it works really well. It has a little tray in the bottom that you can pour water in, and it keeps the whole chamber nice and moist. You can adjust the temperature, so you can manually see the temperature and adjust it up or down. So I find that that proofing box is super great. I use it for making bread. I also use it for making koji. So I like to make my own miso at home, and it's excellent for making it for growing koji. Um, so it serves multiple purposes for me. I'll also say that there are more and more things that are coming online. So I also have something from a company called Sour House that is, I'll just show you real quick because it's right here. It's called a Goldie. So it's a it's a cloche. It has this glass top, and then um, the base warms up, and then you plug it in. So you put your jar of starter on the warm base, and when you turn it on, it has a light in the front that it turns gold when it's at the optimal starter temperature. I wish that I could see the temperature. That would be I would prefer that. But anyway, it works really well. Um, Here in Northern California, we have really cold mornings every time of the year. So I like to use this when I'm trying to feed my starter in the morning, or sometimes make leaven in the morning when my surface, my counters are very cold. So even if the room temperature is warm, if my counter is really cold, I know that my starter is going to be really slow. So rather than pulling out the proofing box, sometimes I'll just plug this in and feed my starter and put it there, and it doubles in size pretty quickly. Sometimes, depending on the inoculation rate, I don't always feed my starter 1 to 1 to 1. But anyway, so this is a really great option if you are doing a lot of baking. You don't have a lot of counter space. You don't want to get a proofing box, but you want to keep your starter nice and healthy. There are other options as well. I think Broad and Taylor has a little kind of like a spa, a little thing, a little house for your starter. It has the temperature and also a little door, but you can't see inside. You have to open the door, I think, to see it. So lots of options, but if you are living in a cold climate, I would highly recommend a proofing box if your starter or your dough feels like it's just really struggling. And one of the biggest things after you get one is a lot of people will write to me and say, my problem went from underproofing to constantly overproofing because my dough just is so enthusiastic now. So it really does make a huge difference. And I think it's something that if you do a lot of baking consistently, that you won't regret having it in your kitchen.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Goodness, we still have so many, but we have to wrap up shortly because
Yeah.
but quick before we let you go, and I just can't thank you enough for joining us this evening. It's been so educational and
Sure.
makes it feel approachable.
Good.
I just want to know what inspired you to revisit Sourdough, to revisit this book, because like this is the 10th anniversary. What made you think I'd like to go back and update, change?
Yeah, yeah. I'm just going to turn the light on because it's it's getting really dark. So the book was published in 2015. However, it was written from was writing these recipes well before that, and was contracted to write the book in 2013. So there's so much that has changed in those, 10, 12, 13 years. And I feel like when I wrote the book, I wrote it to be kind of evergreen. I wanted it to have value for decades. But now that we have so many more options for, as we were just talking about equipment, different types of flour, I did want to revise some of the instructions or clarify a few things that I get asked often. Um, and then also just offer, there are quotes from people that I really admire, in the industry, people that I learned how to bake bread from. So I included some of those just as hopefully like encouragement for people to really not just look at the book. It's a very pretty book to look at, but to really dive in and practice and experience and enjoy and share your loaves with your loved ones, with your neighbors. I think that a lot of us tried to do that over the 2020 2021. I don't even want to say the word, but but there's always a good time to make bread. So I just wanted to encourage folks to do that, and to also just think about ways to use their starter besides bread. And so there's a little bit more information about using starter when it's an ingredient rather than as a leavening agent. So as something that leavens bread, using it in cakes and cookies and scones and that sort of thing. So there's a little bit more information or clarification about that as well.
And I just want to again encourage you all to check it out if you haven't already. It in the book answers, it's so thoughtfully laid out into answering like as I was like I said, I could only briefly flip through before it had to go. Someone was coming on their way to pick it up. I was just sneaking it.
Sounds like you need more than one copy.
We have multiple copies
Oh, okay.
and
Okay.
it is gone.
Wow. Okay.
But I mean, as you would be flipping through, I'm like, well, what is this like word meaning? You have all the terminology or like how when you describe a
Mm,
certain technique, it lays it out in a thoughtful manner. So like as I would think of the question, the next section would be like, now that I've said this, like this will answer here for you. So I encourage you all to check it out. The recipes look amazing and it should answer so many of your sourdough questions. I want to
yeah.
thank you again, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. Do we have time for a really quick demo on how to score?
Sure.
It'll take me we have 3 minutes left,
We
I
have three
think.
minutes.
All right. Okay. We'll jump right into that. So, scoring is done to help the loaf expand in the oven. So when it goes into a hot oven, it's going to bust open wherever its weakest point is unless we give it a score. And so scoring is not just a pretty way or a way to make the loaf look pretty, it's actually quite functional. So it controls that expansion. And we do that using a razor blade. I like to use a naked blade, which is not always advisable. They are quite sharp, but I learned to score with a naked blade. But most people will purchase what's called a lame, which is basically something to put the razor blade on. So it's a handle with the razor blade. But I like to just use the razor blade. So I'm just going to grab that loaf really quickly. And this is, instead of parchment paper, this is a reusable silicone mat. So I can wash this. I can use it many, many, many times. And it has the two handles on the end, which helps me load the loaf into the hot Dutch oven without burning myself. So this is the loaf. It's feeling very puffy. It has a slight dome to it. It's a little bit jiggly, so that tells me that it's in a pretty good place for scoring. So I'm just going to tip that out onto my silicone mat. And then what I like to do to give a little bit of contrast, this is optional, is just to put a little bit of raw flour on top. And then I like to rub that in and dust off any excess. And I always say that the loaf can smell fear. So what you want to do is you want to score with confidence, and rather than sawing through the loaf, you just want to do one score. You can do it down the middle. You can do it 3/4 of the way off to the side. I'm going to do 3/4 of the way off to the side. You will see the loaf start to open up just a little bit. And you can sort of then see into the loaf and sort of look at the fermentation and see how the fermentation is going. But that's really about it. When you're scoring at a 45-degree angle, that encourages the loaf to open up with a little bit of an ear. When you're scoring at a 90-degree angle to the loaf, so more perpendicular, then that encourages the loaf to spread open more. And then if you want to do some decorative scoring techniques, you can do some very shallow cuts. And that's more decorative. It's not going to open up necessarily there a whole lot. And then it's ready to go in the oven. And I just basically pick it up by the handles and drop it into the hot Dutch oven, position the lid, and then bake it with a lid on for about 20 minutes. Take the lid off, lower the oven temperature slightly, and continue baking for another 15 to 20 minutes or until it's a nice golden dark brown. And that's
It looks amazing.
it.
Well,
Okay.
thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
And
you.
thank you everyone for sticking around. I hope to have you, we'd love to have you back again. And please make sure to check out Sarah's book, Sourdough, the 10th anniversary edition at the Learned Adult. And thank you all for joining us this evening. And I hope you have a great night.
All right. Thank you for having me, Alexandra.
Thanks. Have a good
Good
night.
night.
Bye.
Bye bye.